Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Marvel Crisis Protocol character spotlight. I almost said battle report again. One day I'm going to get the hang of this. And today we are taking a look at Mr. Crimson Dynamo. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and get right into things here. So, Crimson Dynamo is a 4 threat. He's the leader of the Winter Guard. And in my opinion, he's probably one of the best 4 threats in the game right now, and honestly, just one of the best models in general. He's incredibly powerful, and we'll kind of go through why and how to really get the best value out of him. So starting out, he's got a relatively solid defensive line, 4-3-4 with 6 health. He's going to be 6 on both sides. Nothing changes on his card between the front and the back, other than the art, of course. Um, He's going to be a size 3, so he's a little bit harder to push into a round, but when he does get thrown, he's going to have a little bit more impact. But he is only a small mover. Now, he's on a medium base, which helps make up for that a little bit, and he has some other tricks that help make up for that as well. We'll talk about in a second. But he is on the slower side. He ain't getting around the board too quickly. Going into his attacks, he has 2 attacks here. The first one is Electric Blast. This is a beam for 5 dice energy attack. After each attack is resolved, he's going to gain 1 power, and it has a Wild Shock. So this is a crazy good beam. It's throwing a solid amount of dice, just being 5, of course. It's a gainer, so if you can get multiple targets, you're really going to be gaining power quickly. And it's got a Wild Shock, which is a really powerful condition, especially one that you can hand out on a beam. And not to mention, it's beam 4, not beam 3 or anything like that. So you can really get a lot of models under this beam, especially if you're playing on the right type of map. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So yeah, this is probably one of the better beam attacks just in the game, period. Really powerful there. And of course, if you're hitting multiple targets and you're able to throw this attack out a lot, eventually you're going to spike some of the dice and probably do some good damage with it as well. Next, he has homing rockets. This is pretty much copy pasted over from Iron Man's homing rockets. It's going to be a range 5 dice physical attack. It's going to cost you 2 power. It is his only spender. And this attack ignores line of sight, and the defending character does not benefit from cover. And it's got a wild explosive, so before damage is dealt, enemy characters within 2 of the target are going to take 1 damage. So this is a solid attack if you really want to fish for that explosive trigger, just to guarantee something dies, or they're farther, they're too far away for you to hit them with a beam. Or maybe physical is their weak side. There's a few reasons you might want to choose this attack over Electric Blast. So in that regard, it's pretty solid, but really important to note here is that it is still only a 5 dice attack, meaning that the most amount of dice Crimson Dynamo is capable of throwing out on his own is just 5. So this model is not going to be turning around and one-shotting big threat models and things like that. He's not going to be really cracking through hard defenses or anything. He's throwing 5 dice. That's what you're getting, and sometimes he'll spike and might do really good with that, but you're not really expecting him to do crazy amounts of damage. That's not really his role here. But it is a nice little bit of versatility that he has that second attack. The explosive can be really nice in the right situation, and ignoring cover and line of sight is always good as well. We'll talk about his leadership in a minute. He is the leader of the Winter Guard, but first we'll go through the rest of his actual things. So the first superpower he has here is Overcharge Capacitors. This is a 0-cost active superpower, but it does take an action, and he's just going to gain 2 power, so a nice way for him to start powering up really quickly if you want. Technically you could do this twice and just gain 4 power on the spot. Might be situations where you'd be wanting to do something like that if you really want to use some of his other tech down the line, and you don't really have any targets that are worth attacking, because like we already mentioned, he doesn't really do much damage, so maybe all your targets are immune to shock anyways, and you can't get multiple characters in a beam, then just do that to gain your power anyways. So there's stuff like that. It's a solid ability. It's one I find I use the least on his kit. Honestly, sometimes I forget it's there. But we'll talk about that as well, because I play him in some affiliations where power is really not a problem for him. Next, he has Propulsion Thrusters. This is going to cost him 2, and he's just going to place himself within 2 of his current position. It can only be used once per turn. So, I mean, that's solid. It's a Gamma Leap for 2. Really powerful thing, especially on that medium base. It's going to help him zip around the board a lot faster than his slow move would imply. And it helps him really line up those beams as well. So, he can place himself in a position where he's hitting 2 or even 3 models with a beam, and then double tap with that beam. So he's actually going to end up gaining 4 to 6 power, based on however many models you were able to get with it. but it allows you to double tap and hopefully build that power back a little bit more often with the electric blast beam there. So it's really, really useful. And also just any character with any sort of movement ability like that is solid. Next is kind of the thing he is known for, his kind of iconic ability, and that is Disruption Field. This is going to cost 2 power, and it's a reactive tech. When this character or another allied character is targeted by an enemy attack and the enemy is within range 3 of this character, he may use this superpower. This character may reroll up to 2 of the attacker's dice. So this is really, really powerful for denying your opponent's triggers, making sure they're doing a little less damage on some of your models, and just generally is incredibly obnoxious to play into. If you play characters that rely on triggers and there's a Dynamo on the other side of the table, you're gonna have a real rough time actually getting those off consistently. I mean, being able to, look at your dice, pick up 2 of them, and say, nope, re-roll those, that means your wilds, your crits, your anything really that might be a trigger is really inconsistent all of a sudden. So that can be super obnoxious to play into and is just a really, really powerful ability. And it only costs some 2 power, which is we've already established between overcharge capacitors and electric blast. This model builds up power relatively quickly. So he can do this a lot, and he can do this relatively frequently because this also isn't like a once per turn thing. Now, one thing you do have to note if you're playing this model or if you're playing against him is the timing on this ability is when the character is targeted by the attack. So it is before dice are thrown that he has to pay the power, which means he's not always going to get the full value out of it. Now, do note that it does say may reroll up to 2 of the attacker's dice. So if I want to pay 2 power and then you don't get any of your triggers, I can choose not to reroll your dice because the last thing I want to do is make you reroll into your triggers, right? And I've definitely had situations where I've done that. I've also had situations where I've made my opponent reroll because they had a good attack roll, and then I made it even better by giving them their triggers. So you got to be careful when you're using the disruption field. It can be a little tricky, but just pay a lot of attention to the timing because if you forget to declare it when they're making the attack, and I like to always warn my opponents going into a game, just say, hey, if you're making your attacks, give me a second. I might have some responses. So that way they don't just start throwing dice before I get a chance to respond. Um, so just some things you want to be careful of because this attack can definitely, or this ability can definitely kind of bite you if you're not careful with it. So really, really powerful ability though, and yeah, I can't overstate how annoying it can be to play into that ability. Just the denial of triggers is absolutely huge. So next he has Curb. Oh, I'm gonna butcher this. Carborundum Matrix Alloy. Whenever this character would suffer damage from an enemy effect, reduce the amount suffered by 1 to a minimum of 1. So standard damage reduction here, which is really, really good. And then suddenly that 4-3-4-6 health line actually looks really good because that is super bulky, especially when you combine that with the fact that he can disruption field himself to try and reduce damage. So yeah, that's some really, really good things right there. Last thing for Mr. Dynamo's card here is he does have the flight superpower, which, I mean, he's a small mover, so that doesn't come up very, very often. But, I mean, if anything, it's actually probably worse for him more often than not, because it means if your opponent's advancing him with something, or if your opponent has stuff that does extra damage to models with flight, such as Beta Ray Bill, that sort of thing, they can hit him a little harder. There are situations where it's solid for you as well, though. We'll talk about some of that in a second. Like mainly stuff where you're advancing your own models outside of activation. It allows him to go over buildings with an advance instead of needing a full move action. So it can be useful for stuff like that. But generally speaking, on a small base, it's not as powerful as it would be on, or sorry, a small move as it would be on a medium move or a large move. So still, not generally a bad thing to have. So yeah, that is majority of Dynamo's base card, and then we're going to talk about his leadership here. So his leadership is Unbreakable Red Line. It is for the Winter Guard affiliation, and it's kind of 2 leaderships smushed into one because both of them are relatively minor, although one of them is really, really good, and the other one can be really good. So the first one is at the start of an allied character's activation, it may remove 1 special condition. So that's really, really solid. It basically means you're never going to be staggered, shocks, incinerates, stuns, all those conditions that can really, really ruin the model's day. Being able to remove those is quite solid. So that's a solid leadership in that regard. And then the second part here is when an allied character is contesting a secure objective and would be pushed, it may roll a die. On a crit, wild, or shield, it is not pushed. So a little under 50% there. I believe it's 3 and 8 odds for that. And yeah, that can be solid. That can really help you in the right spot against the right affiliations. That can be a big deal. I could see that coming up a lot against, say, Web Warriors. I could see that coming up a lot against something like Wakanda if they're running, Black Panther with all of his auto pushes and Shuri and stuff like that. So there can be some really good situations for that. And just in general, could be randomly useful. But it is on a die roll, and it does kind of depend on what type of models your opponent's bringing. So it's not the greatest leadership in the world, but the removing conditions is really, really powerful. So yeah, it's a solid leadership that with the right models can be really, really good. We're not going to talk too much about that because I don't think the leadership does anything particularly special for Dynamo himself. Being able to remove conditions off of himself is nice. I mean, stagger, shock, to some degree even stun, although I don't think stun's actually that bad on this model between the fact that he has damage reduction, so he doesn't take a lot of damage at once, and then his only way of building power is a gainer. I mean, it kind of ruins overcharged capacitors, but honestly, I find in the late game you don't use that ability very much anyways, so yeah, I think it's solid for him. I don't think it's necessarily amazing or particularly special for him, but it is there, and it is, of course, his own leadership. So if you're playing him in Winter Guard, he's going to have that up no matter what. So that's pretty good. As far as affiliations are concerned, he is only available in Winter Guard, but he is a very, very splashable model, and we'll talk about some of the places we can splash him. But in Winter Guard, he's got all of these other models here that he can go with. As far as synergies are concerned, I mean obviously he's the leader, so if you're playing Winter Guard, you're bringing him no matter what. But I do think a lot of these models do appreciate him. A lot of these models are kind of on the bulkier side, and he can kind of push that up to 11. I always find running Crimson Dynamo with other models that have defensive tech can be really, really obnoxious. So, stuff like Red Guardian, I think Omega Red also has a damage reduction. Yeah, he does. So yeah, Omega Red, Red Guardian, I believe. Yeah, this one. No, actually, Ursa Major just has aggressive. Yeah, for whatever reason, I always think he has a damage reduction, but he does have a big health pool. Um, so those are all models that kind of appreciate having someone like Dynamo to keep them even bulkier. And then, of course, it also works really well to just avoid having conditions be thrown on any of your dudes or anything like that. So it can be really, really good, but I don't think there's any particularly huge synergies with any of these models other than the fact that he is the leader. So we're not going to talk too much about specific ones, but yeah, just worth acknowledging that that is his only affiliation. So going back to Mr. Crimson Dynamo here, he also has one tactics card. It is the Fusion Caster tactics card. So the Fusion Caster is one of those attack tactics card. During his activation, he can spend 3 power to play this card. He may use the attack listed above once this activation, so it will still take one of his actions to do, and it's going to cost him 3 power, so it's almost like a 3 cost once per game spender. It's going to be an energy attack. It's beam 3, 7 dice. When rolling additional dice for crit results during this attack, roll 2 additional dice instead of 1. And after each attack is resolved, this character suffers 1 damage for each critical in the attack roll. So this is an interesting card. One thing that's kind of cool about it is that, well, I mean, because of the double crits thing, it has a lot of very high explosion potential. If you want to do, a really big attack, there is a world where this blows up and does crazy amount of damage, which can be really cool. On the other hand, it's going to take a tactics card slot. It's going to be 3 power, which power is very valuable on this man, as we saw with his kit, where it's not necessarily an expensive kit, but he wants to spend for those powers a lot. Um, it's also shorter range than all of his other attacks, although mind you, he does like to be within range 3 of his targets, so he can use that defensive tech. And it is the highest dice attack that he's capable of throwing out. So there's definitely an argument to bring it, especially if you're playing in his home affiliation. Then I could see a world where you'd want to bring this card just to have him have a little bit extra punch. And the fact that you can hit multiple models is really nice. But taking damage afterwards is going to be a little rough, especially because once you double explode those crits, if you get even more crits, that's really going to start to pile up on the damage, especially if you're hitting multiple models with this. So that can be a little bit annoying. But Yeah, I think it's an okay card. It's a fun card for sure. I don't know if it's necessarily all that great, but yeah, it exists and, and it's worth mentioning because it is his character card. So I guess going into other characters and stuff that he would synergize with, as I already mentioned, I really like him with kind of bulkier models, other models with defensive tech. You can really throw your opponent into this weird situation of, they're not going to be able to do anything that they want to do with their attacks, and that's kind of what my list with Dynamo tries to do. So, run a lot of defensive models with really good defensive tech, stuff like, I mean, Black Panther on the front side, but more so, I'm thinking models like Captain America, who's got a bodyguard and he's got a vibranium shield. Models like Colossus, who's got the taunt ability that he has, stuff like that. So you can kind of start to stack these defensive tech abilities together, and then of course, you're using Crimson Dynamo to first of all avoid triggers because you definitely don't want to be thrown around or staggered or anything like that in a lot of these situations. But then also you're just kind of giving yourself a little bit extra consistency on not taking damage. Models like Colossus or Steve Rogers or Black Panther or other really bulky models, they're going to bodyguard those hits. They're going to take those hits. They're going to roll really good dice, stuff like counting blanks, stuff like rolling six dice. And then if your opponent spikes, you're going to be able to kind of negate that a little bit even more. So, you definitely can still take damage from this, but your odds go down a lot. I've definitely had the Dynamo Steve Rogers combo just kind of sit there and be like, yeah, you're not doing any damage to anybody on this team, and you can just deal with that. And it can be a really obnoxious puzzle for your opponent to try and solve. He can also be a lot of fun with some of those models that like you kind of want to be able to control how much damage they're taking. Stuff like Carol, and really any kind of high threat model that's on the squishier side where you're okay with them being punched a little bit, it'll power them up, which is cool, but you don't want them to take too much of a hit because obviously they're high threat models and you don't want them to die. So he can kind of help you control that a little bit more, because as noted, it is a May for those rerolls, right? So if it looks like you're taking more damage than you want to, you can reroll. But if you're kind of like, hey, you know what, one damage is getting through, we're okay with this, you can take that. So yeah, stuff like that can be really good with him. um yeah, so I think like his synergies are kind of more focused on helping the models around him than helping himself. He doesn't really get a crazy amount from specific models. That in mind, there are ways you can make him really obnoxious offensively as well. If you put him beside a model like Baron Zemo, for example, who's got that little reroll aura. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it with someone like Shuri or Invincible Iron Man, where you have to pay for those rerolls, but someone where it's passive like Zemo, suddenly that beam now A has higher odds to shock and B has higher odds to deal damage and can spike a little more. In a similar vein, if you have stuff that can increase the dice or things like that, that can be obnoxious as well. So there's some cool stuff you can do with that. Specifically, you don't want to look for things that are buffing, one attack roll. You want to look for stuff that's going to be a little bit more passive, where you don't have to pay to buff every individual attack, because ideally with Dynamo you're hitting two, three, four models even with every single attack. You don't want to have to pay four, five, six, seven, eight extra power to get all of those rerolls online, especially if you're double tapping. So really good. There's a lot of models that'll work really well with him, but you just got to be somewhat careful about which ones you're doing from kind of a power economy standpoint. As far as affiliations go, personally, I really like Dynamo in affiliations that are also going to help that power economy situation. As I said, I really like him under Steve. Steve 1 to be specific, because I mean, on one hand, he can do stuff like propulsion thruster right out the gate, so he's probably getting some attacks off nice and early in the game. His disruption field costs 1 the first time you use it, which is absolutely huge and incredibly obnoxious. And like I already said, I think Steve himself is a good synergy with him. I think other power-based leaderships could be really good for him as well. Even stuff like original Red Skull, if you deal damage on your attacks, you gain extra power. That could be really, really solid for a model like him. New Doc would be okay for him, I think. Or New Doc Ock. I say New Doc, but that's going to get confused with New Modoc. Um, Stuff like that. I think Cyclops would be a really interesting one with him. The new Cyclops leadership. In a similar vein, actually, I think Storm would also be solid for him, just because I think the other thing, if you're not going for power out of the leadership, then the other thing you want to go for is mobility, because giving him extra ways to kind of move around can be really, really interesting. Mind you, he might be a little slow to keep up with X-Men. I haven't tried him there myself, but I do think under Cyclops he has a lot of potential to be really interesting. Yeah, I think really the general rule is going to be, if it's a leadership that's going to help you gain power, it's going to be solid. If it's a leadership that's mobility based, it's going to be okay. I think I prefer power on him, especially since a lot of the leaderships that give you mobility, and actually thinking about it, I think all of the leaderships that give you mobility actually cost power, stuff like Midnight Suns or the Storm Hop. So I mean they're okay, but they're not going to be quite as efficient for him. Um, so yeah, I think like he's a very generically splashable model. I think you can bring this model pretty much anywhere and he's not going to feel bad. He might not necessarily get full value out of the leadership, but he doesn't really have to. He's very self-sufficient with that beam and stuff like that. If you can give him a leadership that buffs him, then great. He's having a fantastic time. But I don't think he necessarily relies on it. As far as tactics cards are concerned, I think there's only really a few noteworthy exceptions or mentions for him. The first one being from his own affiliation, Winter Rush. I think Winter Rush can be really, really solid for him. So this is basically during the power phase, your Winter Guard team can pay 6 or more power as a team, and then whenever any of your allied characters are damaged by an effect, after the effect is resolved, another Winter Guard is going to get to advance towards the enemy that made the effect. So this is solid because it helps him move around a little bit. Typically, you don't want him to pay into it too much himself. 1 or 2 power, okay, but definitely don't be trying to drop the entire 6 from him, because that could be really, really expensive. And he's got a lot of power, or a lot of things he wants to do with his power. So I would avoid having him spend into it by himself. But yeah, it's a really good card for helping keep him in the fight, especially if your opponent's been controlling him with, medium throws and stuff like that, which can be really annoying for him. Um, so yeah, I think it's a really good card for him. And if you have other members of Winter Guard who are a little more comfortable paying for it, it can help him just kind of stay as relevant as possible. The other Winter Guard card, Sovereign Strike, while I think it is a good card, I don't think he really wants to pay for it, so I think you're better off leaving that to one of your other models in affiliation. Outside of that, I think when it comes to restricted cards, he's definitely a model that can provide a lot through advanced R&D. It's a weird question because I think he's one of those models that's really, really good for being the one to pass out power because of that ability to just gain 2 for an action, which can be really, really good. On the other hand, though, he really likes to have power, so it can be a little awkward there whether or not you want to have him be the one passing out power with that, but it is worth acknowledging that he is very good at it. So that's solid. Similarly, I think the other cards that are kind of relevant for him are other kind of defensive tech cards that he can kind of stack up with. So stuff like sacrifice or escort to safety, or even stuff like fallback, where if you really need this model to survive, he can help make sure they survive that initial hit, and then they can fall back to a little bit more safety. So stuff like that could be really, really good. I really do just like combining him with extra layers of defensive tech. I think that's kind of one of the best things you can do with him. So yeah, Indomitable's kind of a noteworthy mention on him as well. When he gets into a good position where he's within range 3 of a lot of your opponent's models, you really, really don't want to let them just kind of toss him out of the way so he can't do his thing anymore. So being able to keep him where he is great. That's another reason why I do like stuff like bodyguards with him, partially to keep him alive if your opponent decides they want to focus him down, but also to avoid any sort of triggers that might push or throw him away. Try to take those on your bodyguard models, and of course, he can help deny those triggers as well. But That doesn't always work out, so it's nice to have that little extra layer of security there. So yeah, I think there's a few good ones, but nothing really too crazy for him. I think the noteworthy mentions being Indomitable, Sacrifice, Advanced R&D, which I acknowledge is three restricted cards, so there's some choices to be made there. But then also Escort, Safety, Fallback, other kind of generically defensive cards can be really good. Of course, I also like him with models like Luke Cage for Heroes for Hire, or um, and we already mentioned Red Guardian for Comrade's Keeper. So all really good things there. The last noteworthy mention here is scenarios, and usually I don't spend too much time in these talking about scenarios, but I think with Crimson Dynamo, scenario can be really important. He absolutely despises stuff like D maps, where he doesn't have the mobility to really get between them very often, so he's not going to make very many attacks. And also, with everyone on the board as spread out as they typically tend to be on a D map, he's really not getting that much value out of his area thing either. So you got to be really careful what types of maps you bring him on. I think most other maps he can do fine. On something like a B map or an F map, he's very capable of still impacting a good chunk of the relevant board. Um, so he can be really fine, like solid on those still. Particularly, I like in F trying to kind of shove him in the middle of the map and then give him that flexibility of kind of going wherever he wants to be, while also just holding down the center with this bulky model that's really obnoxious and has range to be hitting the side points. So he can be really fun there. Um, but obviously the one place where everyone loves this model is the E shape. The E shape is just amazing for him. Those beams are going to get a lot more work out of them in that shape where it's just straight down the middle, so everyone's lined up and ready for him. Um, he does a lot of work there. He doesn't need to move as much because, it's everything straight down the middle, so he can just kind of sit in one spot and blast away, which can be really powerful. Um, it's yeah, I think all of the E shapes are good for him. Even going into the extract side where he doesn't care as much about extracts as he does secures. He's not really one to be picking up and running around with them. He's definitely a model that's good to be kind of sitting on a secure point and turreting. But as far as extracts are concerned, he also really likes the ease here. Montesi, he's great on Mystic Defense, and Research Station is basically another secure, so he is 100% down with that. Other ones, I don't think there's any that he particularly hates. I mean, the ones that'll push him away aren't the end of the world because he does have that propulsion thruster to help keep him in the fight. Um, I don't know if I recommend grabbing a scroll with him turn one. That can be a little risky. But maybe if it's your back one, it could be okay. But yeah, the other ones I think for the most part are pretty much all good with him. Something like hammers he can be really obnoxious with. Going up to 6 dice on those beams can be really good. So yeah, just he's relatively flexible when it comes to extracts. But when it comes to secures, you definitely want to try to get him on those E shapes as much as possible. I've had a lot of success with him on C's as well. It means his first turn usually isn't as impressive, but once he gets to the fight, he can do a lot. Similarly, I shape, it's kind of just a slanted, C or E map, so he can do a lot there. I think H he can be really good as long as you're good at keeping the Fisk witnesses relatively close together, or even if you're not. I mean, at least half of the fight is going to be with him, so that's good. But yeah, I think he's certainly playable on most scenarios outside really the D shapes, which he's not a fan of. But E is definitely where he gets to run a riot the most. So, and I think that about sums up Mr. Crimson Dynamo here. So yeah, just to kind of summarize here, Crimson Dynamo is an incredibly bulky model that can just be really obnoxious as a good kind of defensive centerpiece that your opponent's going to have a really hard time breaking through. He's going to be applying shock, making all of your opponent's attacks weaker. He's going to be hopefully hitting a lot of targets if you're playing on the right maps with him, and that's going to be handing out lots more of those shocks, doing some plink damage, and powering him up a bunch, so he's going to be able to use his disruption field all the time, which is meaning your opponent's never going to get triggers. They're always going to do a little less damage than they're hoping for, and he himself is a obnoxious, bulky model. Disruption field on himself, obviously helping with that, but he's also just a 4/3/4 with damage reduction, so he's relatively bulky even without his disruption field. And yeah, he's just an obnoxious centerpiece model. I think that's kind of his goal. He's going to sit in the middle of the map. He's going to blast everything a bunch to soften them up and make them a little bit more pillow-fisted, and then the rest of your team gets to run around and do their thing because he's keeping them all alive. He's making it very hard for your opponent to really deal with them in any meaningful way, which can be really, really powerful. So yeah, I think Dynamo's probably one of the best fours in the game right now. He's becoming one of my favorite models very, very quickly. I've been having a lot of success with him in Avengers, and recently I played Winterguard a couple times, and he's fun there too. Obviously, I do miss having the one power thrusters and one power field there, but he's still very, very good in that affiliation. And that affiliation recently saw a nice little glow up with a few extra models added to it in that update a few months back now. So that's good. And if you guys want to see Crimson Dynamo in action, we have a battle report coming up this weekend at time of upload. That's going to be our kind of holiday special, and Winter is one of the teams we chose for that because we wanted to do all red and green models, and Winter has a lot of red, so we went with them. And of course, Dynamo is their only leader, so he was definitely in that game. And yeah, if you want to kind of see him in action, he will be there, and that's going to be going live this weekend. I want to say it goes live Christmas Eve, the 24th. I could be wrong about that though. I'd have to double check. Whatever day the Sunday is. But that is going to wrap up this character spotlight. I almost said battle report again. One day. Um, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please do drop a like down below. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. We do stuff like this every week, as well as battle reports on the weekends. We've been in a little bit of a lull lately, but hopefully we're getting back to it. I'm getting over a cold, and hopefully I'll be able to keep pumping these types of videos out for you guys. But yeah, like I said, there's going to be a battle report this weekend with this model in it, which is great. Looking forward to that. It's already been recorded. It's currently in editing at time of recording here, so that's going to be good. But yeah, if you guys have places where you really like Crimson Dynamo, places where he works out really well for you, let me know down below. Just kind of tell me, what models synergize with him really well for you. Where does he work? Where does he work? Stuff like that. I'm really curious to see where everyone tries this guy out, because I think he's a fantastic model that can play pretty much anywhere. So yeah, I look forward to hearing what you guys think. But that is going to be it for me for this video. So once more, I hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time, have a great day. Peace.